I run into this very paradoxical thing of like, I wouldn't wish this upon anyone, and yet I wish people had the view of it, just temporarily.
Hi, I'm Brilliant, your host for this show. I know that I'm incredibly blessed. As the son of self-made billionaires, I've seen the high price some people pay for success, and I've learned that money really can't buy happiness. But I've also had the good fortune to learn directly from many of the world's leading teachers. If you're ready to be, do, have, and give more, this podcast is for you. Today, my guest is Adam Stern, MD. Adam is author of Committed: Dispatches from a Psychiatrist in Training. It's a memoir that Adam wrote about his time learning to become a psychiatrist, which involved overcoming imposter syndrome and learning the value of human connection. Adam is well studied in psychology, medicine, psychiatry, clinical neurosciences, all kinds of smart academic, scientific stuff, but he's a very approachable human being. He's currently an assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard, and he has won several awards for psychiatry, for writing, and excellence in medical education, and he's also published more than 24 scholarly publications. In this interview, we talk about a lot of things, dealing with doubts after we've made a choice that's important to us, after we've committed to a certain path in life, how to deal with it when it arises, which it almost inevitably will. We talk about the difference between being empathic and being empathetic, how those things differ, and how we can become more empathic. We talk about, especially if you're in any of the healing modalities, like if you work with people, helping them to become more complete or better versions of themselves. I think you'll be interested in this interview. We talk about our individuality, knowing what we want, breaking through to the next level for us, and helping others do the same thing. We also talk about Adam's creative process. He's a cartoonist in addition to being a writer, and following your passion, doing what you love for yourself, and the serendipity that often happens because of that. I think Adam's story is pretty cool in that regard. You can learn more about Adam at his website, adamsternmd.com. You can follow him on Twitter at Adam Philip Stern. That's Philip with one L. With that, I hope you enjoy this conversation with my new friend, Dr. Adam Stern. Adam, welcome to the School for Good Living.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I don't want to go much further before I acknowledge that I could have started that with Dr. Stern. But before we began rolling, we talked about the fact it's okay for me to call you Adam in this. But will you tell me, please, what is life about?
I think life is about a balance between the present moment and your ideas about the future, along with your ideas about the past. And so that to me is what life is all about. And I can certainly expand on that if you want.
Yes. Yeah, I do want to dig into that. And I want to talk about that through the context of your book, Committed: Dispatches from a Psychiatrist in Training, which of course you're through your training now and you're practicing. But I want to actually begin by talking about the fact that you come from a family of medical practitioners, right? And your dad was a doctor, but your dad actually discouraged you from becoming a doctor. Will you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my brother and I grew up admiring our father. He is a cardiologist, still practicing. He's a wonderful doctor. He cares about his patients. His patients seem to care about him. And the idea that you could do good in the world and that society would provide you with a comfortable lifestyle based on that, the idea that you could help people over decades navigate their health and well-being, all of those things were things that we just naturally observed and that drew my brother and me to the field of medicine. All while over the first 20 years of our lives, our father would sort of sometimes talk about medicine as being a challenging field, a field where it's not easy to do the job without feeling the weight of the job, without feeling burnout from the administrative and logistical tasks of the job. And when we were growing up in a particular era, there was a real transition within medicine, where there was the emergence of things like health maintenance organizations, HMOs. The field was changing from the era that my father trained in. And so I think that transition might have also led to a certain degree of feeling discouraged about his kids potentially following in his footsteps. But as most kids do, we didn't listen to our dad, and we both went into medicine anyway.
Now, I know that mental health or mental illness has a stigma. Many people, they don't understand it. They don't know how to deal with it in themselves or someone they love. And it's a field that is not as well understood. Even psychiatry is a field that's not as well understood in some ways, where it's not as mechanical as other aspects of medicine, right? But what is it about this that attracted you? Your dad was a cardiologist. Your brother didn't go into psychiatry. Why did you follow this path?
Right. You're absolutely right. They've never said this to me, but I do consider myself almost like a black sheep of the family, in that I went into this field that has so much stigma around it, and it's so far from cardiology. But all of that being said, what drew me to it was that I effectively, at some point, had to look back at my experience and decide what were the parts of my training in medical school, in even my undergraduate education, what were the things that really inspired my brain, my mind, my heart, for lack of a better word, what made me excited, what made me motivated to do better. And it was always the didactic, the academic course, the clinical rotation that had to do with brain and behavior, the mind, emotions. And part of that is that everybody in psychiatry, patients, psychiatrists, everybody that you might come across in that field, there's nothing really more important than what is important to them, especially when we're referring to patients, what their values are, what do they hope to get out of the encounter or the therapeutic alliance, the relationship, what's the core of who they are. That's the most important thing in psychiatry, even for someone who might just be prescribing medications or something else. And so that idea is what really, I think, drew me to the field in a way that other fields I found really fascinating. But it was, if you want to repair a bone in surgery, you could probably do that for the most part without ever getting to know, the patient's life story, and to me, the life story was the most fascinating part of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. We're endlessly fascinating, aren't we? In some ways, totally mysterious. And in other ways, maybe not that complicated at all, but it's a paradox being human, I think. So something you talk about in the book that I was intrigued by is that many people it's no secret that many people who go into psychiatry are a bit eccentric. Why is that?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question, something that a lot of people pondered. I don't have a real proper answer of well, this is clearly why. But to some degree, I think that people who would connect with that statement you just made about the human condition being complicated and paradoxical in some ways, those of us who have a certain kind of brain for science and go into medicine, but still wonder and marvel at the human condition and how our existence in the world is not summarized by the 4-chamber pump in our chest and the filtration system in our kidneys that are cleaning our blood and creating urine and that kind of thing, that are more fascinated with what makes us the people that we are. I think it sort of draws a certain kind of person. It also draws, hopefully, someone that is by nature predisposed to be empathic. I think people who go into psychiatry who are not empathic do a really poor job, probably. I think empathy is at the core of practicing psychiatry. And it probably draws a certain segment of people who have dealt with their own mental health issues, whether diagnosed or subclinical, and at a level where it's just always, something's always gnawed at them or confused them or made them think more within their own inner worlds. And I think that one of Freud's most advanced, most mature defense mechanisms is intellectualization. So a lot of us will study things that make us uneasy. And going into psychiatry for someone who's had that challenge, I think there's no better example than that.
Yeah, no doubt. Something that you talk about in the book too, that I thought was really interesting is you make this commitment to follow this course of study and a professional path and so forth. And more than once along the way, you found yourself questioning your choice and maybe your commitment. Of course, as we know now, you stuck with it, you got through, and you're still in some ways now that you're practicing, but something that was very challenging. And I do want to know who you wrote the book for, but I also I'm imagining that many people who are curious about if this is the path for them would be attracted to your book. And so before we get to who you wrote it for, will you just tell me a bit about that, maybe those doubts that you had and what it was that allowed you to persist in this course, despite the doubts?
Yeah, so I talk a bit in the book and a lot outside of the book about this phenomenon of imposter syndrome, feeling like you don't belong. And I think that's a somewhat ubiquitous phenomenon, but it's also really the field of medicine and medical training in particular is primed for it. It self-selects a certain kind of person who's self-motivated. You're surrounded by very high-achieving people who outwardly seem like they're doing fine. And you don't have access to all their doubts and self-doubts and things that they wish they could do better, and that number of hours that they're spending just to achieve the basic level of functioning within medicine. So all of that leads to a very, very widespread, really, I would almost call it like a ubiquitous experience within medicine, that at certain points you're going to feel like you're not up to the task. I worry more about some trainees now that I'm in more of a teaching role. I worry about trainees if they don't worry that if they feel like they know everything.
Yeah,
that's not as good as a trainee who's feels like maybe they're in a little bit over their head and they can ask for help when they need it. So, but you're right. Throughout my own training, I can think of so many examples from applying to medical school to getting in and starting medical school and arriving and realizing this is going to be much different, much harder and in a very different way than I was expecting. And then getting into residency, you've got your MD, but then you realize you don't actually know how to do the job that you're now tasked with doing. You have to learn that job on the fly. And so all of those were opportunities to feel that way.
I haven't been through something like that exactly, where you reach a point and you think, okay, I've arrived, I've got the degree, other people acknowledge me, but I still don't necessarily feel fully confident or capable. But maybe there was a certain type of situation or a specific instance where something came up that maybe confirmed for you that doubt? I know you talk about working with a couple of patients that had anorexia. That was particularly challenging, but will you talk about maybe a specific time that really challenged your confidence or maybe even your commitment?
Yeah. So I can think of a couple, right off the bat, in terms of some are in the book and some are not. But one that I don't believe is in the book was a moment in the first year of medical school where I was, after the first few maybe months of the semester or the year, I was on pace to fail a class called Histology, which is the study of slides under a microscope, basically like human tissue, the various organ systems, what they look like in different stains under a microscope. And that's a very fundamental thing. It obviously has almost nothing, really almost nothing to do with what I do now as a physician, as a psychiatrist. But it was not connecting with me. And I just remember, on the verge of tears, calling my mother. This is at age, 24 years old, 25 years old, and calling my mother and saying, like, I don't know if I can do this, and, with persistence and with sort of reevaluating how I go about my studies and that kind of thing, eventually you start to gain some momentum and realize, okay, if I approach it this way, I'm able to do it. I'm not worse off than anybody else here. With enough hard work and encouragement and mentorship about the best way to do it, I can achieve this thing. And so that was a lesson, and I did, and I did fine. Obviously, I didn't go into pathology where this kind of study is like of paramount importance, but that idea that if I just figure out the right way to learn this, I'm as good as anyone else here at putting in the hours and the effort to do it, then I can do that. That idea carried me forward for years, even in residency. In the book, I talk about a number of different patient encounters, a lot of them happening overnight, where it's really a bare bones crew. It's like one or two residents taking care of the psychiatric needs of the entire medical center. And those moments where you feel like, oh, I'm in over my head because this patient is experiencing mania, this patient is experiencing suicidal thoughts or hearing voices or paranoid. I don't know no one ever trained me in how to do this particular task of calming someone down when they're upset about X, Y, or Z. That kind of feeling of being overwhelmed. If you even go into those micro experiences, those momentary experiences of, okay, I will just keep going forward with my most earnest self, trying the best I can, asking for help when I need it. Those are all very powerful tools to get through something. And once you've gotten through it, that's another arrow in your in your arsenal. That's something else that you can use in the future to remember, to get better and better every time you go out and do the job.
Yeah. One of the things I love about that answer is that it's so honest. Like, it seems so simple. You were earnestly doing the best you could. You were asking for help. And in some ways, right, like you just talked about, a defense mechanism is intellectualization, sometimes at least, right? But I'm curious, how do I phrase this question? How did you balance your training, which is very intellectual, which is academic, which is theoretical, it's kind of divorced from a specific time and place and person, with your own intuition? How did you, and I realize all of us have to kind of find and feel our way through our lives, but can you talk about how you reconciled, how you knew when it was time to rely on what you had learned in a classroom or a textbook or a lecture or whatever, and what your own inner sense was telling you?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because there are all kinds of different angles that I can think about it from. But one of them is, in psychiatry, there are all these hangups about they're both sort of societal impressions of what a psychiatrist is, and also actual training about how to react and what to do and what not to do. So, there's a very small scene in the book where it might actually come up a couple times in the book, where I feel like the human empathic response would be to put a hand on a patient's shoulder to make a human connection, and in our training, it was sort of like, well, you never really want to physically contact the patient unless it's for a medical reason, and it just felt so alien and fed into all of those concerns that people have about psychiatrists being disconnected, aloof, cerebral, all those things that we think about, all the sort of stigma around psychiatry. And so I think that there's at least one, maybe two moments in the book where I'm able to lean into intuition more and the formality of training a little bit less for what I think was the patient's benefit. And I think that comes with experience. So when you're first in a brand new situation, you're going to be much more reliant on the instructions that are handed to you. One of the things that now that I'm, about 8 years out from the end of the book, eight years out from training, one of the things that I've gotten much better about is realizing that the rules are there to be mastered and then sometimes disregarded when you think it's for the best interest of the patient. Some rules are not. Some rules are hard and fast, but some, like, is it ever okay to put a hand on the patient's shoulder with their permission? That kind of thing. If the moment is right, you can bend that rule.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of a parallel from my life, which is basketball, where, somebody just starting out is taught, never leave your feet for a pass. But then you watch the superstars, they do that all the time. Right. It's like you're saying, you master the rules and then you learn when it's okay to break them or when it's maybe necessary or important.
Right. And just like those NBA stars, when you're doing something at what you hope is a high level. For me, I'm not. The last thing I want to do is compare myself to an NBA star. But when I'm in with a patient, there's no administration, there's no audience watching in. You're just trying to do the best thing for the patient, right?
Yeah.
If that's your compass, so if an NBA player it wants to perform at the top of their ability, they might remember that they're not supposed to leave their feet for a pass. But if in that moment they think, I've been trained for this moment, I know it's the moment to try to intercept that pass or what have you, then that's the time to break that rule. And I feel like I think that analogy actually holds pretty well in any kind of performative thing where you're on your own and you're trying to figure it out in real time.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, thanks for that. So let me ask you, who did you write this book for? And how do you hope they receive it? What do you hope it does for them, or that their life is different because they picked it up and read it?
There's the truth, and then there's the other truth in this answer. The first truth is I wanted everyone to read this book. I wrote this book for a wide audience. I wanted it to be like a big hit that people read at book clubs, and anybody could read it. I wrote it. My natural writing style is colloquial and down to earth, and people can read the book pretty quickly and easily without having to look up too many words or anything like that. It's not dense. It's the opposite of dense. So that was my goal, was to write the book in a way that was really accessible to a big audience. But now that the book is written, I can appreciate the fact that there is a built-in audience for anyone that's interested in psychology, young people that are thinking about going into some corner of the field of mental health care. And that's an enormous field with all kinds, psychiatry is just one tiny little component of this overall apparatus. But anyone interested in the care of other people, starting from the person, so medical professionals, psychological professionals, anybody within the broader field of mental health care, even within the field of academia, where there's a lot about the culture of, sort of training and feeling lost in this book.
Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned empathy. You used the word empathy. How can we become more empathic?
Wow, that's a great question, because I do think that most of us are born with a certain tendency toward empathy. Some of us, I'll just tell the very quick anecdote that as I was writing this book, I was finding myself using the word empathic, that the psychiatrists are supposed to be empathic. And then I read someone else's book where they were using the word empathetic. And I said, what's the difference between these two words? I was like, I know that empathetic is a real word. I used to use that word all the time. How come in psychiatry I'm only using this word empathic? And when I dug deep into that topic, which sadly it went down a little bit of a rabbit hole, I learned that empathic is referring to the person being an empath, the person being sort of drawn to taking other people's perspectives. Whereas being empathetic is something you can put on and take off. I can put on an empathetic tone, and then the next sentence I can take it off and not use that tone. But being empathic is a state of being to me. And so that's why in the book, in psychiatry in general, we talk about people being empathic. Can you cultivate it? I think to a degree you can. And I think some of that comes in the long term. I think it helps if you're raised by empathic people. I think it helps if you're taught, that the values that in our family we hold dear are X, Y, and Z. Caring for other people is important. Those kinds of things are useful at a training level, from youth. But if you're an adult and you want to become more empathic, which I think is mostly your question, I think it comes from practice. I think it comes from making conscious choices to go out of your way to do that, making a habit of that. And then over time, I think people will find that they're more able to do it naturally without even thinking about it.
Thank you for that. That is an interesting distinction between empathic and empathetic. And I like what you're saying about being empathic is a way of being. And it's something that we could probably cultivate, but maybe only to a point. I mean, just like we all have a height, right? We all have physical attributes. It makes sense that we all have kind of emotional attributes as well. But then within what we're given, we can either cultivate it or ignore it and
Right.
so forth. And to me, empathy is something that's very close to love. It's definitely different. I think that's why we have two words for it. But as I look at myself and I realize that I might be closer to the end of my life than the beginning of my life and how I want to be remembered and the kind of person I want to have been. And I think many people are this way. I see this in the coaching that I do, that many people do seem to make a shift from, acquisition and accomplishment to a qualitative way of living, even beyond any specific goal and that kind of thing. But then it's like, okay, that's a major life shift. But then that question of how, right? And you're saying it's a choice. And I realize this is kind of an abstract conversation because it's again, individual. What does this mean for each person when they walk in the door at home or they show up at work, how they are? What have you found for yourself that has been useful, either as like a habit or a practice, something you've begun or you've stopped doing that has helped you think has helped you to cultivate this quality of being empathic?
Yeah. And in some ways, I think that skepticism and I don't think skepticism is quite the right word. I think in some ways, what I think is the opposite of empathy is an inability to appreciate the world that you're living in and your life in that world. And so something that I've started doing in the last few years is literally practicing gratitude, taking some time every day to think of specific things. They can be big or small, abstract or concrete, but specific things that I'm appreciative of in my life in that moment. And that has been actually, I think, very helpful in helping me cultivate and sort of optimize my levels of empathy. Because if you are irritable, if you are disgruntled about things that are going on in your life that you feel like you're being forced to do, or you're, people being treating you poorly or anything like that, that's an empathy drain. Those things will drain your empathy faster than anything else. If you feel like you're not getting a good deal in this life, that you're being unfairly treated in this life. And the antidote to that is to practice gratitude, in my opinion. And that's something that I started doing personally a couple of years ago after I came across some of the literature that shows it has all kinds of benefits, even health benefits, things like reducing hypertension and, people having a higher quality of life.
Yeah, gratitude is such an interesting subject for me because sometimes, and I don't know if you have this experience yourself or you work with other people in this regard, but sometimes attempting to practice gratitude can kind of backfire, I think, right? Because it's like intellectually, I can know I should be grateful, but emotionally, I might not feel it. And then there's this sense of like, well, why don't I feel the gratitude that I should have, especially when I'm comparing myself? Well, I have food, I have clothing, right? I'm not in a conflict zone. Like I can know all that, but it doesn't mean that I feel it. And I remember one time Tony Robbins, who of course espouses gratitude as a practice as well, when he talks about, he'll say, think about what you're grateful for, and then think about why. Right? Like as trying to access the emotion more fully. But what's your experience with this thing where gratitude can sometimes just be a concept and other times it can be something that we actually feel? And how do we get closer to the feeling?
Yeah. My thoughts on that is that I think that a lot of cognitive processes, the thoughts and sort of chains of mental, sort of arithmetic you're doing behind the scenes, I think a lot of that can be likened to exercise. And so if you go to the gym or you go for a run or you do whatever you might do one time, it might be really challenging. If you make a habit of it, it starts getting easier, and not only easier, but you start actually sort of doing it better and more naturally. And so I think that to me, something like that, there are absolutely moments where I say, okay, before I go to sleep here, I better come up with 3 things. Not in the mood to do this. Don't feel like practicing gratitude. But I think that that's gotten less and less the longer I've been doing this. And I think that it's in part because, our brains are, like you said earlier, our brains are very poorly understood in terms of when compared to things like the heart or the lungs or the kidney, in terms of the very mechanics of how it all works. But one thing that's pretty well figured out is there's a plasticity of how our minds work, and that change can happen. And practicing cognitive or behavioral techniques to change habits can leave someone in a sort of changed state. So that would be my response. I do think it's hard, and sometimes you do fall into a trap of comparison. Well, I had a really rough day. Can I just skip this today, kind of thing? And sometimes you do that. Sometimes I do that. But on the other hand, it's never. I do think it's sometimes a trap to compare yourself to other people, to say, look, I've got all these wonderful things in my life. Why do I feel this way? Asking the question, why do I feel this way, is a powerful tool, but only if it gives you better insight into what you want to do with that feeling, or how you want to address that feeling. If it's used as a sort of a way to make yourself feel worse about why you feel that way, then usually it's not a useful thing, I would say.
Yeah. On that point, you're right. And why is such a fascinating question, because sometimes it can be the most empowering question we can ask, and other times it can be just an endless regression that we use to make ourselves feel worse or stay stuck or whatever. It's totally amazing. Well, talking about, some of these qualities, being grateful, being empathic, one of them that I'm really struck by that you share about in the book is the quality of presence. And I think it was on a whiteboard you wrote a note, "Here with you." I think those were your words.
Yep.
But that was something that I got the sense, maybe you could talk about why you wrote that. But I saw that, and that was, I think, in your 4th year, where earlier in your training, maybe you hadn't yet seen the power of just being with another. Will you talk about presence? Will you talk about that message on the whiteboard and what you've learned about it since?
Absolutely. I think that one of the paradoxes in psychiatry and therapy in general is that we know that all these super different approaches to therapy and the therapeutic alliance, they might be night and day in terms of technique, but they all have been shown to be effective in various ways. And so something like cognitive behavioral therapy is super different than a psychodynamic, insight-oriented therapy is super different than acceptance and commitment therapy. There are all these techniques, and they're all incredibly unique. And yet they're all effective for different people. Why is that? The thing that they all have in common, this is my idea that's probably shared by a lot of people. In other words, they would say, oh no, I thought of that too years and years ago, is that the thing that all of these approaches have in common is they're at the core is the human connection between a therapist and a patient, or just two people, right? And so when any two people are in a room together, the thing that you can always count on is that they're present together. I just watched some clip of Quentin Tarantino talking about the movie going experience as being superior to watching a movie on your TV by yourself, which I might disagree with. But his point was, with the going to the cinema, you're having this shared experience. You have an individual experience with the movie, but it's within the context of this overall group. And that only happens one time in the entire universe. And that's what makes it a special. You don't know who's going to gasp and who's going to share your emotional reaction to a scene, etc. So I thought that kind of resonated with me, that there is something powerful in being together. And the therapeutic alliance can only really happen when you're feeling like you're sharing an experience, right? And so in the book, I talked about this particular patient, Charlie, who I saw over a couple of years in different environments. And I was with him as he got progressively sicker with cancer diagnosis, until at the very end of his life, which was fairly well known that it was going to come at some point. He was largely unresponsive, and I visited him in a social way in his last hospital room, and I couldn't have a conversation with him, but I felt compelled to leave a little message on the whiteboard that was in the hospital room that just said that I was there. And it gave me comfort to know that that message was there all the way until he was no longer even in the hospital, until after he had passed away, presumably. And it reminded me, it's such a basic human sort of moment to me, because it reminded me even of what little children do. When children are beginning to go off to school, or they're beginning to go away, or to a sleepover at a friend's house or something like that, they'll often have what in the field we'll call a transitional object, something that they bring with them that reminds them of home, of their family, of whatever it is that they're venturing away from. And so that power of this teddy bear, this little trinket, I've got all kinds of silly things on my office desk. Here we go. There we go. Anyway, so my point is, there are all kinds of things that have meaning to me, that are here and make me feel more comfortable. Leaving that tiny message on the whiteboard just made me, as the person who was surviving that experience, feel okay with walking out the door, because I knew I was leaving a tiny part of myself behind.
That makes me think about how remarkable it is that we can be present even when we're not physically present. We can, someone can feel close or connected. And conversely, we can be together and feel an enormous emotional distance.
Right.
But I just think this is an interesting thought, because it's one that I think we live with, but we don't necessarily, A, we're not necessarily aware of, and B, we don't cultivate, and how our lives could be improved if we did, that kind of thing. So thank you for sharing that. I was touched by the thoughtfulness and your example in the book. You mentioned Charlie had cancer. I understand you've had your own experience with cancer as well.
Yeah, I'm going to be very open and frank, because that's how I approach this topic. But so content warning for anyone who's anxious to, doesn't want to hear about cancer or end of life stuff. But I'm currently living with cancer. So I'm, as you can hopefully see, I'm well. I'm at the office. I'm feeling good. My last couple of scans have been very encouraging, but I've been living with this for almost 4 years.
Sorry to hear that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, but I appreciate that comment, but at the same time, it's something. I almost brought this topic up earlier, but I didn't want to jump the gun. When we were talking about gratitude and empathy, and how do you view life differently? I wouldn't recommend this for anyone, but a major life stressor like living with cancer and suddenly, out of the blue, being diagnosed with something really changed how I viewed the world in all kinds of ways. I think that maybe within the first few months, I felt less empathic. And then beyond that, I actually felt more empathic, and I was more able to connect with people. And I also changed the way that I view every single day and what kind of things I want to do with my life. And that was, I wish I were under different circumstances. I really do. But under the circumstances that I'm in, or within the circumstances that I'm in, I have to say that it has brought certain gifts as well.
You've talked about and written about the depression that has come with that. And will you talk about that and how you've dealt with it?
Yeah. So, it's hard to compare, like my own experience with anyone else's in particular, or with my concept of what a clinical depression looks like or anything like that. But, for me personally, when I was diagnosed this was a kidney cancer, it was stage 3 at first in 2018. At that moment, I looked up the survival rates for 5 years, and it was like 50-50 essentially. And then when it metastasized in my lungs, it was down to like 8% at that moment for 5-year survival. Now, what I didn't know at that moment was that survival rates are backwards looking. So they're looking at data from the last 5 years, not the next 5 years. And you're not a curve. You're a dot on that curve, right? You're an individual. And so it's a trap to suddenly get this diagnosis and then feel like your world is over, like the future that you thought you had, it is gone. It's not gone. It's just different, I should say. And so it's a trap where very often people have to come to terms with the idea that life is different than they thought it was, but that at a certain point you realize that life has value. What lies ahead of you still has value. And it can be as incredible as serendipity might allow, but only if you put yourself in the position to actually engage in life. If you become despondent and withdraw from your life in the face of a potentially lethal illness, then you are forfeiting your hand. You're giving up what opportunities you may have. If I had done that, I never would have had my second little boy. I never would have written this book that we've been talking about. I never would have written all these essays that led to the book, all kinds of things that I look back on now as some of the most incredible parts of my life. Seeing my almost 5-year-old become a more fully formed person. All of those were things that weren't guaranteed, but that I had to, sort of commit to being an active participant in my life again before they could actually happen.
That idea of being an active participant in one's life is also an idea that's interesting to me, because I think we kind of go in and out of that, right? At periods in our life, or at least throughout any given day, that there's things that are difficult or they're unpleasant, and there's escape and, avoidance and this kind of thing. But I appreciate you talking about this, and it sure brings up a lot for me. I am curious to know, when you get a diagnosis like that and it changes the way you see the world and the way you live, having living with that now, do you think there's any way that one can have that kind of life-changing perspective without having to go through a diagnosis? Like, how can we more fully appreciate our lives, or how can we more fully engage with life, or how can we more fully fulfill our potential, this kind of thing, without going through that? Do you think it's possible? And if so, how could we do it?
Right. I always ask myself that same question, because I run into this very paradoxical thing of I wouldn't wish this upon anyone, and yet I wish people had the view of it, just temporarily, just spend an hour, knowing that your time is limited, because that's true of all of us, right? That's something we all share. Nobody knows what is going to happen in their own lives. Some of us just have been given a sort of a glimpse of the likely path forward, but no one has a guarantee to live to 100 or anything like that. So I have asked myself that question quite a bit, and I haven't come up with the right answer. I wish that I had. Sometimes I will be in conversations with people, and I will notice myself saying in my own inner monologue, "My goodness, you've got to change your life," because you are not living according to what you want. Your values say that you want to be close with your children, but you're working 80 hours a week. Your values say that you want to get along better with your family, but you're doing X, Y, or Z to distance yourself from your family. Sometimes I'll catch myself saying these things to myself. I know that I want X, Y, and Z, and why am I acting in this other way that's counter to that? So, one of the things that I would advise people, and I don't know if this is totally feasible or if it's wishful thinking, but I would advise people to really set out what their goals are, not like concrete goals, but what kind of outcomes will make them most content, not like happy, joyful, but content that the life they're living is the one they want to be living. Because one thing I know for sure, and this is something that the diagnosis really hammered home for me, is that there's so much of what we do that is based on the inertia of just doing what comes next and the feeling of responsibility to do what's asked of us. And those two things are very dangerous to me, because we can build up a certain momentum and just keep going down that road, even though it might make us miserable or leave us feeling hollow or lead us down a path that we just never really wanted to be on. And we forget that we're empowered to make choices, and we can say no to things, and we can say yes to things that someone else looks at and says, why on earth would you do that? So those are pieces of I don't know. They're not wisdom, but they're definitely insights that I've had since the diagnosis that I wish I could convey to people.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I'm reminded here again of this difference between the intellectual, the understanding of something and the emotion and the experience of something, and how there seems to be, in my case at least, often like a glass ceiling between those. And I feel like I'm touching, I'm accessing that emotion, but it's also kind of scary. Like it's raw. It's not something I've read some of the Buddhist teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, and he wrote a book called the Shambhala, The Path of the Sacred Warrior. And of course he puts it very poetically about letting your raw heart be open to the world and things like this. And in moments I feel like, oh, I can do that. I'm willing to do that. And then there's other times when it's like, that's hard, man. Well, thank you for talking about that.
I just want to add, there's something to this idea that so many of people that we consider enlightened and sort of having figured it out live very basic existences. There's a certain sort of I don't know, the material aspects of our lives. Sometimes they can be wonderful, and sometimes they can probably do more harm than good.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And as you said, many people who are perhaps enlightened do live a simple existence. And even the Zen saying of before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. But even for those that do seem to have it, figured out or know something the rest of us don't. Like I was just reading online a little bit more a couple nights ago about Alan Watts, the celebrated philosopher and Zen teacher who died of alcoholism, I think before he was 60. And it's just amazing. And Chogyam Trungpa was also a well-known alcoholic and so forth. And that's not even to say of the spiritual teachers that seem to have other moral issues, but none of us in this human incarnation seem to, walk on water yet.
No, you're absolutely right about that. We're all imperfect in our own ways. And yeah, I think you've got that. You've got that right.
Something I want to talk about is the power of questions. You share an anecdote in the book about your first, as I understand it, was like your first therapeutic appointment, and you began with kind of a soliloquy about what you hoped this would do for the client or the patient, and later you learned that it was more effective to start with a simple question. Will you talk about what you've learned about the power of questions?
Absolutely. So questions can be so broad that they open up the entire world to someone else. They give them the opportunity to choose whatever sort of answer that leads them down a certain path that they want. And they can be so narrow that they close off important things. So the more that I practice psychiatry, the more I have appreciated the power of open-ended questions, at least in the beginning of a conversation, because as a psychiatrist, my goal is to figure out what's important to the person. They might not start off with what's important, but if you let them talk for long enough, you're going to get there. Whereas if you fill out a form that has checkboxes of yes or no or maybe, are you having trouble sleeping at night? Are you eating okay? Are you experiencing feelings of guilt or low interest in activities? These are symptom checklists. That is the fastest way to a diagnosis and the slowest way to figuring out what is bothering a person or how you can help them. So I have figured out that with more experience, I've learned that it is good to start out a conversation by just figuring out how you can get to know someone. And that's a very powerful thing to ask without sort of agenda. What brings you in? What's on your mind? Those kinds of things are so basic and yet so powerful for someone like me who wants to know truly how they can help.
Yeah, and they're so simple, right? That what brought you into the office today? What's on your mind? I read once about that's the question that Facebook asks it as the prompt to have you make your post, and that they've, of course, toyed with, they've tested different questions and found above and beyond that what's on your mind is like one of the best prompts.
When I was in training and supervision, this isn't in the book, I don't think, but one of there's a process where you with a supervisor, you'll present your process notes, like this is how this therapy session went. The patient said this and I said this, and then they responded this way, and then I responded this way. And the supervisor, who's well established and well trained, can point out ways that you might have gone in a different direction, or consider how it might have impacted the patient. And it was like one of my very first sessions with a very well respected supervisor. And I said, so how have you been doing? And right off the bat, he sort of stopped me and said, we don't care how he's been doing. We care what's on his mind. And it was like it seemed so strange. And then there was another version of it that was like, what's new? And it was even worse. It was like, no. Like, what's new is what's new, but that's not why the patient's there. The patient's there for help with something, or because they need to figure something out. And what's new might just give you a tiny little corner of that. So what's on your mind is a much more powerful question.
Yeah, that's great. And I imagine, like reading a transcript of an interaction or just evaluating questions, there's this whole other component that wouldn't necessarily show up in that, which is then the power of silence, right? Will you talk about what have you learned about silence in the interaction with another person in a therapeutic or maybe a coaching kind of situation? What have you learned about it, and how do you use it deliberately?
Yeah, silence makes most people pretty uncomfortable. I think in the book, I talk about this sort of 7-second rule. And so when I talk about this topic, I like to demonstrate it just briefly for anyone listening, where we're going to practice silence for like a good 7 seconds. I'm going to count in my head, and then I'll come back in, starting now. So that's 7 seconds to me. That I might have even rushed it because I was nervous, to not make everybody wait too long. It's uncomfortably long when no one's talking. And one of the reasons that in my field, we're trained to become used to and sort of exist within the silence and not rush into the next topic of conversation, is because the silence is a tension that we all experience that sometimes can break through a layer of defenses, where a patient might actually break that silence with something else that is underneath the surface. They might actually bring something up that leads you to the next thing, that leads you to something important. And so conveying to a patient that you're not afraid of the silence, that it's okay to just sit together quietly in the room for a couple minutes, if you have to. You don't want to stagnate, but you don't want to rush into another superficial topic when a patient might need the space to actually take a moment to actually think of, not even consciously, but just arrive at something that's more under the surface, that's more important to them.
That is such a cool way for me to think of silence, is that it's as a tension that can help like break through or elicit something that previously wasn't available. And that you literally, and that's one of the things that's so beautiful and fascinating to me about these interactions. And I love your term, the therapeutic alliance, is that you can help create that someone can then bring something forth that was already there, that for whatever reason they didn't bring forth already, or maybe weren't aware of, or whatever. That's a cool way to think of silence. Thank you for that.
One demonstration of it, if you think about any time that you are walking in a hallway and someone else is walking in the opposite direction, you're about to pass, even if you're friends, you are almost never going to pass without verbalizing, hey, how you doing? Even though you're not even stopping, right? You're saying, how you doing, to fill the silence. You're conveying hello, but you could do that with a wave. You could do that with a nod. But hey, how you doing? I just love that question because it's so false. It's literally just there as a placeholder to convey, I see you.
Yeah.
I see you. And we're not going to walk by each other in silence. I think that it makes people very uncomfortable.
I love that you brought this up because I learned from Sadhguru, the spiritual teacher. He said that it's his belief, and I might be misquoting him, so I just want to acknowledge that part of the mental unwellness in our culture is based on the dissonance of that simple question, is that we ask, and then of course we don't. They're not really wanting a full explanation. And so basically we lie. And there's this dissonance between our experience and what we're expressing. And he said, in India, we don't ask people how they're doing. We just look at them.
Wow. I didn't know that. That's really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
I don't want to make, again, a self-aggrandizing comparison, but I did write a piece for the Harvard Health blog where I was trying to say, this was after this was after like the day that I was literally waiting for the results of my cancer test. I ran into a colleague and he said, "Hey, how you doing?" And I said, "Oh, you don't want to know, basically. It's a longer conversation than this." And he's a good person. He stopped and we talked a little bit, but it prompted me to think, let's not ask ourselves how we're doing if we don't actually care or have the time to listen, So I wanted to start a movement, and I've tried to do this for myself. But I still sometimes fail at it, even to this day, where I try to say, "It's nice to see you," if it's nice to see the person, or even "I see you" is a harder thing to get away with, to pull off. But I think that's so interesting that in other cultures, this isn't a phenomenon.
Yeah. Well, and as I understand, even in the Indian culture, that literally translated namaskaram is "I see you." Right.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe more poetically, the divinity in me sees the divinity in you. But how beautiful, even though it's become colloquial and it's a hey kind of thing in many cases, it's still that literally that's what they're saying. I love that.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked a lot about this book and your life and your career. What haven't, before we transition to the enlightening lightning round, what haven't we covered that you think maybe the listener would benefit from or enjoy hearing about?
All right. I've got a couple of things I'm gonna go through that I think we haven't covered. So one is, why would someone go to medical school to then subspecialize in psychiatry? If you're someone out there listening and you're interested in, you're listening to this podcast, you're probably interested in things like, how do you live a better life? How can you achieve better levels of contentment, that kind of thing. You might be considering, or you might even be in a field where you're going to turn this into part of your work, your life's goal. And why would so a little corner of that is, well, what kind of path should I take? And what I would say is, I ended up in psychiatry really through the back door, because I really loved psychology. And then I decided I wanted to be a doctor like my father. And then I said, well, now that I'm on the path toward being a doctor, I realized, no, I really want to do what I'm most passionate about, connecting with people. And so I think within this little field of medicine, psychiatry is the best for me. And so that's how I ended up in psychiatry. But there are degrees out there that are better at connecting with people than psychiatrists, things like PsyDs and PhDs in psychology, social work, coaches, people that are doing work that has nothing to do with my medical training, where they get to connect with people at a much more basic level, or more thorough level, deeper level, all kinds of things. So I would never discourage someone from going into psychiatry if that's what they wanted to do, but I would encourage people to open your eyes to the entire world of human connection within the professional realm. There's a tremendous array out there that you can get exposure to and sort of get a feel for, and then let that guide you in your path.
I suspect that's exactly what somebody listening to this needed to hear, and maybe they didn't even know it. So
thank you. The second concept that I've learned through circumstances, I don't think I would have come across this if I hadn't followed the exact path that I've been on, is that for much of my life, and I suspect this is true of a lot of people out there, I lived a certain life that was where a certain amount of my self-worth, to my own estimation, was based upon achievement that fit into a certain box. Academic achievement, writing papers that would get into medical journals, even going back 20 years, getting into a certain kind of college, that kind of thing has been hardwired into me, in part because of who I am, and in part because of what was instilled upon me. And it's only until I really, became an adult and had the thread of all of those things sort of lifted from me based on this illness, that I've realized that at this moment, the things that I find most important have almost nothing to do with achievement in that way. They have much more to do with trying to align my actions and behaviors with my values. And that might be, again, trying to be a better dad to my kids, trying to be a better husband to my wife, trying to be a better son to my parents. Those things carry so much more weight than they used to for me. And now it really, I'm sure, sounds silly to a lot of people out there listening, but really pause and think about your day-to-day life and how much of it is spent doing those kinds of things versus trying to achieve the next milestone in your academic training or what have you. And those kinds of achievements, getting getting a paper published into a journal. I hope my colleagues at work are listening as I say this. They mean so much less to me now than they did 10 years ago. They're still really important when they're important, right? When a project, a research study that I've partaken in, that I've participated in, gets accepted somewhere and might help change the field in a way that might help patients, that is extraordinarily rewarding for me. But when I'm on a paper that gets accepted somewhere and I know that this paper probably isn't going to move the needle, that is sometimes something that I think is time lost. And I say to myself, I'm not going to take that opportunity the next time it arises. If I can identify it in advance, I'm going to redirect that energy toward the things that I think are really important, whatever they may be. We all have different ideas about that.
Yeah, I appreciate that view. Maybe a kind of a corollary to that. I look at my dad, who was an extraordinarily successful entrepreneur, and I often ask, could he have achieved everything he did in a fraction of the time, 70%, 80% of the time he invested? And I suspect he could have, but I don't think he asked himself the kinds of questions that you are now.
Very hard to thread that needle, to know how much is enough to achieve your quote unquote dreams, or, to get there, to make it, when I look at people in politics or celebrities of a certain kind, or, and they just continue to grind. The only way I can think of it is that grind must be how they achieve a sense of flow, how they find some sense of peace in the world. Because when I look at the grind, sometimes I think, they made it. They don't have to keep trying so hard, but they do. And the way I think about it is that is their state of being, that they must not know how to be content any other way.
Yeah, I'm with you, and I'm so fascinated by this. This could be its own whole book to explore, what motivates us and whether people can be driven to these incredible levels of achievement by what I would call empowering emotions, versus it seems like the majority of people who succeed, at least according to a worldly measure, are actually driven by very disempowering emotions. And I think a lot, and I realize it's just my judgment, right? But my armchair philosophy, but I think about that saying by Jung about a man will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing his own soul. And I think that people do that. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for that. How are you doing, by the way?
I'm doing well.
Good. Okay. Well, if you're good, then I want to go ahead and transition us to the enlightening lightning round.
Let's do it.
Okay. So this is a series of questions on a variety of topics. My aim, for the most part, is to ask the question and stand aside. You're welcome to answer as long as you want, but I'm going to work to keep us just moving through this. Okay?
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Question number 1. Please complete the following sentence with something other than a box of chocolates. Life is like a
series of opportunities with all kinds of consequences. I think that we exist in this moment in time that's warped at all times in our perception by what's just happened, and also what we hope or worry or fear might happen. And so in that moment, we always have the opportunity, based on our free will, to make choices. Sometimes we have more choice than other times, but it's always an opportunity. And that opportunity always comes with rewards and consequences and everything in between. That's what I think about life.
Okay. Thank you. Number 2. Here I'm borrowing the technologist and investor Peter Thiel's question. What important truth do very few people agree with you on?
I think that psychiatry, to some degree, is pretending to be something that it's not. I think that psychiatry was invented by a neurologist out of wishful thinking, that we could look at the mind from a top-down process as opposed to a bottom-up process, which would take another 100 years from when Freud was first publishing. And, before that, certainly there have been other psychologists from all kinds of different parts of the world. But psychiatry as a field right now is very clearly trying to be a medical subspecialty and partially succeeding. And one of the bargains, this is the part that I think is most controversial about what I'll say, because everything I've said so far, maybe some people are nodding along like, yeah, I get it. But one of the bargains that we've made to become a medical specialty is to create diagnoses where they don't exist, that we've justified them because of a certain degree of validity and reliability. If you show 5 psychiatrists this patient, they'll agree that they meet criteria for this diagnosis. But what I think is that at its most granular level, most quote unquote diagnoses in psychiatry are probably amalgams of lots of different things happening, and that we can make patterns out of almost anything in medicine and as people in general. And psychiatry has become very good at that. And so I think one of the risks of our field is that we have gotten away from treating individuals as individuals, and that one of the redemptions for our field sometime down the road, it might be 10 years from now, it might be 100 years from now, will be to look at a person as an individual and to offer what we think is best for that individual, regardless of what categories they might fit into.
Well said. Thank you. Question number 3. If you were required every day for the rest of your life to wear a t-shirt with a slogan or a phrase or a saying or a quote or a quip on it, what would it say?
I suppose after this conversation, it has to say, I see you.
I love it. Okay. Question number 4. What book, other than your own, have you gifted or recommended most often?
Most recently, I've been recommending The Code Breaker. This is a book by Walter Isaacson about Jennifer Doudna and lots of competitors and colleagues who are unraveling this amazing natural tool and trying to expand upon it, called CRISPR, to edit the human genome, to potentially do all kinds of wonderful things and potentially do all kinds of controversial things. If we had the ability to have parents choose to have taller children or less tall children, is that a good thing? Well, probably not such a good thing. But what about to eliminate things like hemophilia or genetic disorders? Well, that's probably a very good thing. Most people would agree on that. So finding that line is a really interesting part of that book, and I've been recommending that to a lot of people who I think would be interested in it. And one thing that I keep thinking about and trying to respond to this question is that there's an old Roald Dahl book called Danny, the Champion of the World. Are you familiar with this book?
No, I love Roald Dahl, but I don't know this book.
So I'm going to be very frank. I haven't read it since I was very young in grade school. And so it might not be like I remember it, but when I read it, I said, that's my favorite book, and it remained my favorite book for a long time. So much so that I think I haven't reread it because I'm afraid to read it and realize like it's not as good as I thought it was. Oh. But in this book, there's a father character and a son character, and the father is very often poaching pheasants, which like poaching birds from some large farm. And I remember as I was a small child reading this book thinking that that's going to be an important part of life, is knowing how to poach poultry, and then as I've grown up, I've realized like that probably represented something else in the book. It wasn't about the poaching of the pheasants that was really the important part. It was something else. So I don't know. That question just reminded me of that, and I think I have to reread that book. But anyway, if it's like it was when I was 9, it's a wonderful book.
It sounds like if your son is 5, he's getting close to where he might also appreciate that book.
Right.
Right.
Maybe we can read it together.
Yeah, that's great. So you've traveled a fair amount in your life. Of course, the pandemic's changed travel for all of us, but what is one thing you do or you did when you travel to make your travel less painful or more enjoyable?
Traveling with people that you travel well with is an incredibly important thing. I'm thinking, this question is landing with me at a particularly bad time. Forget about the pandemic for a moment. We've, in the last 4.5 years, have only traveled with a small child. And we don't travel well together, even though I adore him to the moon and back. And so traveling with people that you travel well with, that you enjoy seeing the world with, doing things with, that's irreplaceable. And if someday, if my boy listens to this interview, I hope he forgives me for saying that. But just know that we do not travel the same way.
Traveling with children is its own art and science, no doubt. And what you're saying about a traveling companion, oh my goodness. It's like a +1, -1, the difference between having one that you enjoy and that makes the journey go smoother versus
right.
one that's, oh man, you're always waiting for, or you can't agree on anything.
Yep.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Question number 6. What is something you've started or stopped doing in order to live or age well?
Right. Sometimes I wonder, am I succeeding in that effort to try to live better? I mean, I guess that's a big theme of the show. But I, think I've made a lot of changes in the last few years in the context of this diagnosis that we've talked about. I used to love those incredibly inexpensive ramen noodles that you can get at any corner store. I used to love them. And I just have this hang up like that's probably not so good for someone with one part of one kidney. And so I've given that up, and I miss it every day. Those ramen noodles. And at a more I don't know, philosophical level, I've tried really to ask myself, is this what I want to be spending my day doing? Is this what I want to be spending my energy doing? That's a theme, I've already talked about a number of times today with you, but I can't tell you how many times the answer is no. Actually, 5 years ago, I would have done this differently, because right now I can see I don't want to do that. I'm going to change the way I'm doing that or approaching that. So there's a really concrete and a really more vague answer for you.
Thank you. I'm reminded of something I once read that Ernest Hemingway said or wrote: never do what you sincerely do not want to do. Like, that's interesting. I try to phrase my advice when I give it in the affirmative, but that's the abstain from.
Yeah.
So, okay. Question number 7. What's one thing you wish every American knew?
Oh, it's hard not to answer this in the context of our current circumstances around how divided we are and how divided it feels. Yeah, I guess I would say, I guess I will answer it in that context, and I'll say that we have so much more in common than we do than what separates us. There's so much more humanity shared between us than what separates us. I feel like I really wish, if only we had that sense embedded in us, that our lives would just be so much more harmonious and less filled with whatever descriptor you want to call this current era of division and rage and being angry with one another, even though we've never met, kind of thing.
Yeah. Question number 8. What's the most important or useful thing you've ever learned about making relationships work?
I think that you have to meet people where they are. And so this is true personally, this is true professionally, any kind of relationship where you're trying to connect with another individual and share an experience or share a connection, share a relationship, etc. If someone gives you, some sort of signal that you're not seeing eye to eye, that you're talking past each other, that they're not ready, or that you're not ready to do the thing, they're too ready to do something that you're not quite ready to do, trying to say to yourself, can I adjust? Can I meet this person where they are? Or is that a bridge too far? Am I able to do that? So therapeutically, sometimes, there's this little terrible joke in the book that's widely known in the field about psychiatrist changing a light bulb. It only takes one, but the light bulb has to want to be changed, and it takes a really long time. Sometimes patients aren't ready to do something, but they are ready to do something else. And so even if it's not what you prescribe, but it's halfway there or a quarter of the way there, you take that and you try to align with them in that goal, because that's better than not going anywhere. And I think you could extend that to personal relationships.
I think so. Thank you for that. And question number 9. Aside from compound interest, what's the most important or useful thing you've ever learned about money?
I haven't learned that much. I think the more I learn, the less I know about money. But the first most important thing is that we can feel pretty content with a lot less money than we think we can. I'll just be very frank that, I grew up the son of a cardiologist who gave us a really comfortable life, which is probably a very different life than you may have grown up with, than someone else may have. I don't want to make any assumptions, but it's also more, we grew up with more money than I currently make, and as a psychiatrist, and I've learned actually that I can live really comfortably like that with less money than I grew up with. That's sort of a mind-blowing idea, because I spent the first 25 years of my life thinking, oh boy, how am I going to match the lifestyle that I grew up with? So that's been a really interesting thing to learn. And then the second, this would also work for potentially for an earlier question of, what's something that people might disagree with, but more and more I think they agree that most money, the idea of money is really a construct that's made up entirely, and so we've all agreed to play by this rule for the most part, that we'll treat money like it's a real thing, but it's not in the way that kids understand it. It's something much more complex, and that when I learned that idea, it somewhat shook me, because you realize that you spend so much of your life's energy trying to accumulate this thing that is pretend, that we're all pretending. We're agreeing to pretend that it's a thing.
Yeah. And I think now cryptocurrency is exposing that in some new ways, right? It's
right.
It's pretty remarkable. Yeah. Thank you for that.
I don't think there's anything more clear about how it's an agreement to call something valuable than the early days of crypto, where it's like, oh, this is valuable because people are willing to pay for it. That's what, and you could say the same thing for certain currencies, all currencies. So it's incredible. But like I said, the more I learn, the less I know about this topic. So
yeah,
the faster we move on, the better for me.
Well, just real quick, a point of trivia on this as well. I just heard on, I've started listening to Apple News. It's kind of in between USA Today and NPR. And so it's very listenable, like 8 minutes. And they always end with kind of an interesting segment of some sort. And one of them last week was about how last year, during the pandemic, there were 5 million new millionaires created globally. It blew my mind. That this whole thing of decoupling, a resource whatever, gold or timber or something else from a currency is just amazing. And who knows what it means for the future of humanity, universal basic income or something else, who knows?
Right.
Okay. Speaking of money, one thing I have done to express gratitude to you for making time to talk with me and everyone listening is I have gone to the microlending site, kiva.org, and I have made a $100 microloan to an entrepreneur in the Philippines named Joy. She's 30 years old. She has 2 kids. She and her husband run a fishing business. So they will use this money to buy a fishing net and materials to make a fish trap. So I hope, and by the way, I won't receive any interest from this when she repays it, when Joy repays this, but it'll go to the field partner who facilitated it to hopefully become a virtuous cycle where other people will improve the quality of their lives in the same way. So thank you for giving me a reason to make that microloan.
That's great. Thank you so much for doing that.
My pleasure. Okay, so the last part of the interview here is about writing and creativity, your habits and routines. Might ask you a question about marketing and promotion or publishing. But something that we've talked for 90 minutes already and we haven't touched on is the fact that you're not only a writer, you're not only a doctor and a father and a husband, but you're a cartoonist. Will you talk about how do you see, like, how does cartooning fit into your life? And how is a life of creativity really kind of one thing, if it is?
Right. Well, let me first put a disclaimer that I'm a cartoonist because I say I'm a cartoonist and because I've drawn some cartoons. I'm not a cartoonist because I know how to be a cartoonist. In other words, I have no, how do I put it? I have no gravitas within cartooning, except to say that I enjoy doing it. And where it came from was the very first time I ever did a doodle with the idea of sharing it to someone with a punchline or a gag cartoon sort of embedded was when my son was first born, and I was up at all hours of the night in the early days, but sometimes he would fall asleep, but I couldn't get into a sleep because then I would be awakened as soon as I fell asleep. It was like that kind of thing. So I got into the habit of when I was on duty with my son, I would stay awake and I would doodle these cartoons because I couldn't do other things. I was when you're in charge of this tiny newborn, you sort of have to be on call and ready. And I was like, well, just feels like I have this new iPad. I'm going to do this, and it'll be something that I can sort of entertain myself with. And then I put it down. I stopped doing it. And then when the diagnosis hit a few years later, I started, or actually about 13 months later, I picked it up again because, like writing, cartooning is something that I do to help me process my experience of the world. It helps me make concrete something that I've noticed that I feel like I need to articulate in order to better understand it. And so I've done all kinds of cartoons. Some of them are psychiatrically related and some of them are completely off the wall, out there, having nothing to do with anything but whatever the topic of the cartoon is. And I love it more than anyone else loves my stuff, So this is something that, like the writing, I've always hoped I was a decent writer. Getting this book published was sort of like hey, maybe you're pretty good at writing. You're good enough to write this book anyway. Cartooning, I have no hope whatsoever that someone's going to be like, you've got it, kid. You're going to be a cartoonist. Never going to happen. But I do it anyway, and I love it. It's one of my favorite things to do.
That's awesome. I'm really glad to hear that. And I hope that people listening take inspiration from your example of doing something because you love it and having the courage. I would imagine it does take some courage to put it out there in the world, to put it online, or in the case of the book, to publish it, right? Because to be honest, my perspective, you shared some things in the book that were not necessarily flattering about yourself, but you did it with an awareness. And I think that many people, what's that saying, that doubt kills more dreams than failure ever will?
Yeah.
And you have put this out in the world and your love for it is evident. So thank you for that example.
Absolutely. I think you're right on there that, nobody wants to read a book, by the way, where the protagonist is, fully self-actualized and just firing on all cylinders. There's got to be, and if I was going to do an honest reflection of what my time in training was like, it had to be filled with self-doubt and lots of things that were not that flattering. I think that that's the only way that book could be written. But thank you.
What was the moment you knew you were going to write this book?
There's a particular moment. So it exists not at the beginning of the journey and not obviously at the end, but somewhere in the midst. By that point, I had already been contacted. So the way that this progressed was, I wrote my whole life in various ways in different formats. Once I was diagnosed, I had this weird, unique perspective as a physician and a patient. And I started looking at the medical system from the patient's perspective and seeing all the ways it's very strange and all the ways it's imperfect. And I wanted to write essays about that. I wanted to write essays about what my experience as a patient was like. So I started doing that. And one of those pieces got the attention of a literary agent who asked me if I'd ever thought about writing a book. And first, this was like a wonderful opportunity that I thought about a lot. Over the years, reached out to literary agents without much success or really any success. And so the idea that someone was coming to me asking me about this was wonderful. I said, yes, of course. I've thought about this my whole life. And so then we had to come up with an idea. And we went through a whole series of different options where I thought maybe we can sort of take the ideas I put out in these essays and turn them into something tangible that's worthy of a book. And the idea kept being sort of coming back as sort of insufficient, both from the agent's perspective, but my own as well. We needed something original. We needed something where I was an authority on that story. We needed something that was based on truth, but with some liberties taken to protect privacy. We needed something that we could sell. This was the truth of the matter. So there were several months where we were bouncing ideas back and forth where I thought, this is never going to happen. I had this great opportunity to get signed up with a literary agent, but in fact, it's just that's where the story ends. And then one day, this just happens to be true, that my best ideas always come to me when I'm in the shower. I think it's because it's usually first thing in the morning, and it's usually when like all the rest of the noise of my life is blocked out, and there's not anything happening besides my own inner thoughts. It's pretty much on autopilot, and so I'm able to be by myself quietly for a moment, for 10 minutes, and I thought, I had a pretty interesting experience in training. Nobody really knows what it's like to take an MD and turn them into a psychiatrist. That idea is a story that I can't think of a way it's been told in a really captivating, interesting way. And I could make it interesting by telling it as a first-person narrative where I met my wife, where I experienced, this sort of state school to Harvard transition with these really brilliant people around me. And they all had their own interesting stories. I could do like a Grey's Anatomy version of this that would, I think, be compelling to readers from all across the spectrum. People who don't really like medical memoirs to people who really love medical memoirs. And so when I thought of the idea, I said, I think that's it. And I didn't know it was going to happen until I ran it by the literary agent, and she said, that's great. That could be a big book. And then B, I had to get my wife's permission to tell our story from my own perspective. When she said, okay, then I knew this was going to happen. That was the moment when I said, the biggest hurdles are now behind me. The agent saying it's going to happen and my wife saying it's okay.
That's great. And for those who haven't read the book, they won't know that your wife kept your relationship very private for a long time, right?
In fact, yeah, she had me use a pseudonym for the character that's named after my wife. And, she's a very private person. And one of the things that delights me about this book coming out is that apparently one of the top searches associated with my name on search engines is Adam Stern wife. Like, there are people out there trying to figure out who this woman is. I adore that.
That's funny. That's great. So I just want to reflect back on something you said, because I think there's a lot in there. And it affirms for me, by the way, that every book truly has a story, its own story, of how it came to be. And in this, one of the things that I'm just kind of dialing in on is that you were saying I love, first of all, that you reached out to an agent before this and never really got a response, but then you took action by writing and publishing, by sharing these essays. And one of those, eventually, it was like a line in the water that did get the result you had wanted, but didn't achieve until you took action, which is cool. So then an agent reaches out to you, and then together, as you're collaborating on what is this thing that we could write, and you're doing the messy, difficult work of creative, brainstorming and problem solving and so forth, of going, well, maybe it's these essays. No, that's not quite strong enough. But what do we need it to be? And when you said original, something in which you were an authority, and something that was honest and saleable, like something, and that kind of comes back to original, that this transition from an MD to a psychiatrist, nobody had really written. And then I love even your handle, like that shorthand of like, well, there'll be kind of a Grey's Anatomy version of that. So anyway,
thank you. I had to think, because I like I said earlier when we were chatting, I think that I wanted the book to be accessible. I wanted it to be, there might be something in there for anyone to latch onto and really enjoy. And so I think this book had those elements. It has, I hope it really has sort of like an interpersonal drama, if that is what you enjoy reading. And it has the guts of, how do you turn someone into a psychiatrist?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it does. I think you hit that mark. And at the same time, my experience is, even once we've made a decision or we've settled on something, it's easy to waffle. It's easy to doubt. And so from here, where you had that clarity, and in retrospect, it all sounds so clean and simple, right? But how did you, once you arrived at those, or once you made those decisions or arrived at that clarity, how did you then, as a matter of course, get the book done? Obviously you're very busy with family and working as a doctor and this kind of thing. How did you arrange your schedule? What habits and routines did you use? How did you go from that idea to the published book?
Yeah, I don't know how it might have happened under normal times, but just as it happened, by the time the deal to write the book was done, I had basically, it was really maybe a month and a half until the pandemic hit and we were sort of locked down. And then we had set up in one of the bedrooms, like a makeshift office so we could be working from home in various capacities. And so I would find myself at home, in those days, this is like March 2020, I guess, we were suddenly at home like all the time, as many people in society were. And so I had to do this. If I didn't do this, it wouldn't have gotten done. I had to say, I'm going to write something every day, at least half an hour. I'm going to shoot for like 500 or 1,000 words. And I don't care if I write much more than that, that's wonderful. If I write less than that, I'm going to get back on the horse tomorrow and try to do better. And it doesn't matter if the writing is any good. I just need to write. And if I got myself to sit down and keep up the momentum, the writing seemed to get better and better. And if I lapsed and I didn't write for a little while, which happened a few times, I would have to sort of rebuild my momentum again. And one of the interesting things that I have found, and I heard this feedback from editors, and then I see it myself, is that the book I think the book gets better and better as it goes along. So if someone's on the fence about reading the book, I always have to say, just get past page 80. It really picks up at page 80. And nobody else really identifies with that as a marker. But to me, it's like, once you know the background and the people involved, then the story gets more and more interesting. And so I think that's a function in part of how I got into a groove of writing, because I was doing it every day. It took me maybe a month to really get into that groove.
Yeah. Momentum is a real thing, and inertia is real.
Yeah.
What tools and technology were useful to you, or maybe even indispensable, in getting this book written?
Yeah, well, one of the things that was important to me was to be able to reach out to all of my former colleagues. At this point, years later, they're all scattered around the country. And so the idea of literally being able to be in touch with them is something like if I tried to write the book 20 years, maybe not 20 years ago, 30 years ago, like I'd have to write pen and paper letters and track down these people. I wouldn't, so I give a lot of grief to the social media out there that it's probably doing more harm than good for us. But I'm, as in it as anyone else. But being able to email my former class, and say, look, I'm doing this thing. I need you to get on board. If you want me to not include you at all, let me know. I'm happy to not include you. But everyone was very supportive. They came back to me with all these anecdotes, all these stories from our time together. And, I wrote the book from my own perspective, but it includes a lot of content from friends from that era of my life. And, that's something that I couldn't have done without. I think it would be a much inferior book without that ability to stay in touch with people from 10 years ago, that live all around the country and the world. So that's not the most cutting edge technology email, but, it's an important thing, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. How did you collaborate with your editor? I know some people will pass drafts back and forth. Some people will just redline, working through something like Dropbox or Google Drive. Other people will actually go in and collaborate in real time. Like, what was that relationship like?
Yeah. So I worked with a couple different editors, actually, if you include, copy editing and then proofreading. And, I actually this went through, 5 different people at various stages in terms of getting to redline it and edit and mark things. But the primary content editors was the initial editor who made the purchase for HMH Books was Deb Brody. And one of the most frightening moments of this experience for me, the first time I was working to write a book for a publishing house, was when I sent the first 20,000 words over. For context, the whole book is about 70,000. And I think she advised me to send it over when I'd written a chunk of it. So I said, okay, I'll do it after 20,000 words. And there's a possibility that as I hit send, that she's going to reply. She's a very reputable person in the field. And if she replies and says, this isn't what I thought I was purchasing, this isn't what I thought we were doing, I'm sunk. I don't know how I recover from that from a writing perspective. If she says, you got to start from square one again, I don't know if I have the energy for that. I poured my heart and soul into these 20,000 words. So there was a moment there where I was terrified, but she actually came back that she really thought we were on the right track. And she had very useful feedback about not giving certain things away early to the reader. One of the biggest challenges for me as a new memoir writer was to figure out, how do I tell this story with the proper arc? From real life, I have to create these arcs that the reader appreciates the most. How do I optimize the reader's appreciation for what happened to us or with us, And so that ability to help carve that narrative was really helpful from her. And then it transitioned to my next editor was Karen Margolo, who's a wonderful editor. And she and I I would send, drafts along the way, but large sections being done. Once I knew I was on the right track, I was much more confident. And that also helped with the writing, I think.
Wow. Remembering that, the intended audience for this is those who have their own creative project, those who are either in the middle of writing a book or it's a dream they've been harboring for a long time. What advice or encouragement would you give to somebody who's either in the position of being maybe stuck in that messy middle, or they've been reluctant to begin? What would you say that would help them get their book done? What instruction or inspiration would you offer?
So this is in line with a lot of the content that we've already covered today, but like doing the project, whatever it may be, if you really truly just want to do it for its own sake, right? So writing something for someone else is usually a bad idea, but if you want to write something for yourself and someone else, that's a good idea. And then even if no one else ends up reading it, it's still something that you've put together that you can be proud of, that you have done, that you like, or that hopefully you feel was worthwhile. And tied in with that is that this whole process for me has only reinforced this idea of serendipity being, this major aspect of how things happen that's out of our control. I can't tell you how many moments there were where it was a binary. Either the editor made a bid or they didn't make a bid. Either the agent reached out to me or they didn't reach out to me. Either she thought it was a good premise for a book or she didn't. Where it could have gone in any direction. And this book was incredibly close to never happening, and when it came out, it either could have been well received or not well received, or anywhere in between. But, I'll give you one example is in my head, I was like, oh man, if only maybe the book could be like reviewed by like a major newspaper, like the Times would be amazing. If the New York, I grew up, and I still read the New York Times a lot. I've written in the New York Times. I said, that would be so great if they reviewed it. They never reviewed it. But People Magazine made it their book of the week. And I was like, that's something I never imagined. I never thought like, oh, if only People Magazine would highlight the book. I didn't even know People Magazine highlighted books. But when they highlighted it, it opened up this entire world for people to discover it, So again, something I never would have predicted to happen that serendipitously happened. And if I had shut myself off to that experience or not taken the chances that I took, or even felt like, oh, if it doesn't succeed commercially, I'll feel like a failure. If I took that attitude, none of it would have happened. So again, getting back to this idea, do the thing because you want to do it. And then everything else that happens to you and the book and the process, it's all gravy. It's all something that you can take the positive from and not be disappointed in it not living up to some idea that you had.
I love that. I love that so much. And I may be putting something in your words that you didn't say, but you talk about serendipity, and what I'm hearing possibly is grace. Right? Like how awesome that is, that all those things, you take this action, you do it because you want to do it, and something remarkable happens.
Absolutely. I try to live my whole life like that. I mean, really, honest to goodness, like that's what I try. I don't always succeed. I really don't. But if I just, have shrunk down the world to a smaller, more manageable alignment of like what I want to be doing with my time, and then good things happen from there. And my perception of those good things are less tainted by things like disappointment or envy.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, cool. Well, Adam, this has been a pleasure for me. I'm really grateful that you accepted the invitation to come on the show. I'm very grateful that you wrote the book, for the conversation that we've had. I hope that people listening have enjoyed it and benefit from it. I suspect they will very much. What final words would you like to end with?
First of all, thank you, Brilliant, for having me, and thank you all for listening. And my final piece of advice is I see you, and also go out and do it. Whatever the thing is that you want to do today, tomorrow, next year, 10 years from now, take the chance. Do it if you want to.
Awesome. Okay. Again, my guest, Adam Stern, author of Committed: Dispatches from a Psychiatrist in Training. Hey, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the School for Good Living podcast. Before you take off, I just want to extend an invitation to you. Despite living in an age where we have more comforts and conveniences than ever before, life still isn't working for many people. Whether it's here in the developed world where we deal with depression, anxiety, loneliness, addiction, divorce, unfulfilling jobs or relationships that don't work, or in the developing world where so many people still don't have access to basic things like clean water or sanitation or healthcare or education, or they live in conflict zones, there are a lot of people on this planet that life isn't working very well for. If you're one of those people, or even if your life is working, but you have the sense that it could work better, consider signing up for the School for Good Living's transformational coaching program. It's something I've designed to help you navigate the transitions that we all go through. Whether you've just graduated, or you've gone through a divorce, or you've gotten married, headed into retirement, starting a business, been married for a long time, whatever. No matter where you are in life, this 9-month program will give you the opportunity to go deep in every area of your life, to explore life's big questions, to create answers for yourself in a community of other growth-minded individuals. And it can help you get clarity and be accountable to realize more of your unrealized potential. It can also help you find and maintain motivation. In short, it's designed to help you live with greater health, happiness, and meaning so that you can be, do, have, and give more. Visit goodliving.com to learn more or to sign up today.